resetting your dopamine habit addiction. And I want to be using addiction in a very loose sense because it's not like when you are diagnosed with addiction necessarily. This is the minor addiction that most of us have in our day-to-day lives, you know, whether that's that chocolate at the end of the day or video games or alcohol to feel like you can have fun, that sort of thing. The minor addictions in our lives that most of us can relate to and most of us have. So the way that this usually goes is I'm going to put up a PowerPoint. We're going old school here, you know, we're going back to basics, and basically talk through dopamine, which is our pleasure and motivation hormone. Now, for those of you who are watching this, whether you're here live or whether you're watching this after, the comment section is always very, I'm very engaged in the comment section, I'll say. So if you have questions about this, if you have things you want to add because maybe you are a dopamine expert, I would love to hear that, share it with the community so that we can all learn from each other. That's the hope of Shoshin Show. So Shoshin, for those of you who may or may not know, is a Japanese word. It comes from martial arts and it means beginner's mind. So that's what we're doing today. We're beginners. We're here to learn. We're here to seek to understand and ask questions. Fair? Okay, shall we get into it then? Dopamine, our pleasure and motivation hormone. So here we go. What is so cool about dopamine is that it exists in all animals, even worms. So this really blew my mind when I first learned about it, because you don't think of dopamine something that has a modern buzzword to it, right? That dopamine hit that we get from social media. We hear people talking about it all the time, but you never connect that to be such a basic hard wiring that you share with worms. But we do. We share it with all creatures. And that's why I think it's really important to understand how it works and functions so that we can just get a sustainable relationship with dopamine and not have that immediate gratification type of relationship with dopamine where it's a high and a low and a high and a low. Especially in today's dopamine-rich ecosystem, we are all becoming primed for that immediate gratification, aren't we? There is this space between desire and consumption. So when you desire for something, do you immediately need to consume it? Or can you let that space prolong? Or maybe you can choose to not even consume. Do you have that level of control? That's essentially what we're trying to get to with dopamine. Because that way you have full self-efficacy, right? From an emotional intelligence standpoint, self-awareness standpoint, sustainability, productivity standpoint, it's going to be ding, 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 check all the boxes, right? So there's two main sources of information that I'm going to use today. The first one is from Huberman Lab. If you've heard of him or check out those videos, please let me know. Such a fantastic wealth of information from a scientific lens. And then the second piece of information that I'm going to be using is from the book Dopamine Nation by Dr. Anna Lemke. I believe I'm saying that correctly. You can let me know. But she's the author of Dopamine Nation and has dealt with so many patients on the spectrum of addiction. Minor addictions who are just looking to optimize their life, all the way to major addictions, people who are, unable to sort of complete their daily tasks because they are addicted to something. So the rest of the research that I'm going to be sharing or examples that I'm going to be sharing is from my own learning. So I have to say that I have a neurotypical brain. So if you are somebody who is neurodivergent, you may want to take this with a grain of salt, especially if you are someone who has ADHD, because from what I understand, the ADHD brain is deprived of dopamine. And so the seeking of dopamine or the craving of dopamine is going to be quite high, and you may or may not have control in that space. So everything I'm going to be sharing here today is from the perspective of a neurotypical brain. So you take whatever you need to take. And then obviously if you have a neurodivergent brain, you may want to work with somebody who is a specialist in that area. So dopamine is a chemical messenger. It essentially transmits information in the most basic sense. Okay. And what it's responsible for is movement and drive. So when dopamine is released, it tends to make us look outside of ourselves. So we want to pursue things outside of ourselves. We want to crave things outside of ourselves. It moves us towards goals. And you can think of it kind of like a currency. Dopamine is the way that we track pleasure and success. It's a currency for pleasure and success in our minds. And there's this, beautiful balance, let's say, that's always going on in our subconscious mind between pain and pleasure. And that this is distilled to its simplest form, right? When pain is high, little things will give us pleasure. But when pleasure is high, then we're going to be kind of maxing out on our pleasure until we have some pain so that our pleasure dips, and then we can start to feel pleasure again. This is mind-boggling to me, because what that means is we can't keep feeling pleasure over and over again and be like, wow, life is good, and we're always in our happy state. That's just chemically not possible from a dopamine standpoint. This pain-pleasure balance is governed by dopamine. And pain here, is the definition of pain, is when you want more of the thing that gives you pleasure. So imagine you're eating this bowl of chocolate. For me, chocolate is my kryptonite? Sure, let's say that. I love it, okay? Love it so much. So imagine I'm eating a bowl of chocolate. The first one is going to feel the best. And then after, I'm going to get less and less pleasure from it because my dopamine is sort of maxing out. And we'll talk a little bit about that relationship of what happens when you have too much pleasure, and then how do you actually reset so that you can start to feel pleasure again at the same intensity, right? Intensity matters here. So dopamine is naturally connected with all of your happiness hormones. So this is a dopamine release example. On the bottom, you've got your time elapsed in hours, and at the y-axis, you've got your percentage of baseline. So what's going to happen when dopamine releases is that there is this peak and a tail. Okay, there's two elements to it. So the peak is going to vary by intensity, so by height, okay? And then your tail is going to vary by length. It might be a short tail, might be a long tail, depending on the behavior, depending on the event. For example, if you took a cocaine hit, you would have a really high peak. That intensity would be like, bang, I got so much pleasure. Damn, that feels good. But then the tail is going to be a quick drop. So you're not going to have sustainable pleasure. It's going to drop quite quickly, and you're going to go back to your baseline. And then your pain is going to go up because you're going to be like, ooh, I want that again, so that you get that peak again. So that's that like balance of pleasure and pain that's happening in the background of our minds. So when we use the term dopamine hit, do you see why it's not truly accurate in terms of our language? Because dopamine hit doesn't account for two things. One, it doesn't account for the intensity of the peak. So how large was this hit? Okay, how intense was this hit? And then it also doesn't account for the length of the hit. So was this hit sustainable, or was it unsustainable and you lost your pleasure really quickly? We don't know. So if you hear anybody saying dopamine hit, now you kind of know, what does that actually mean? Is that intensity? Is that a long tail or short tail? What does it mean? Well, let's find out what it means. Shall we? Okay, so I'm actually going to go back here. I'm going to go here now. So this one is, oh man, this was like a moment of truth for me. Like, yo, I got to do something about my dopamine. I got to really think about my relationship with all of these different habits. Because here, you see that you have a peak, so right in the beginning here, and then it goes down past your baseline. So everybody's got a dopamine baseline, okay? Yours is going to be different from mine. And then this tail, going to go down underneath your baseline until you have a new established baseline. This is going to be lower than your original baseline. And this drop in your dopamine baseline is negatively proportional to the peak, okay? So I'll give you an example. When I was traveling in Europe, it was like a month-long trip. And in week 3, at this point, I had already seen all of these beautiful, fascinating sights. I had all of these different dopamine hits. But on week 3, I was in Rome, near the Vatican City, on the Pope's birthday. And this was actually a really big deal, okay? I didn't feel anything. I didn't care about it. I literally just wanted to go back to the hotel and just rest. That is what my brain wanted to do because I wasn't getting any pleasure anymore. I had all of this novel experience. Remember, everything that we were showing you here was about this novel stimuli. So when you get novel stimuli, you feel that dopamine, but after a while, you have a new lower baseline, and so you can't feel that same level of pleasure anymore. So after 3 weeks of Eurotripping, I didn't really care, okay? For you to internalize this for yourself, so if you have a promotion that you recently experienced, or if you just gave birth, or if you ran a marathon, something that is going to give you an immense amount of pleasure, chances are you're going to go back to a lower baseline and then just need more stimuli to feel that same level of pleasure, okay? The good news is that you do reset and come back to your original baseline, wherever that was, but it just takes some time, okay? So Eddie is in the house. Woohoo! Eddie is saying, does that mean that specific dopamine peak can't happen again? Yes and no. So it depends on the time frame. So say we're talking about a dopamine peak with this smoothie, okay? I'm having this smoothie. Feeling kind of hungry, got a little hit of pleasure. If I take another sip right now, probably won't feel that same peak. Might be a little bit lower, okay? If I was having this every single day, probably wouldn't feel a lot of pleasure. It would just be something that's habitual, something that I do. But after a while, say I didn't have this for a week and I came back to it, I'd be like, oh my God, this is the best smoothie ever. And I feel that intensity of peak again. So it's almost like an ebb and flow, and it really depends on how frequently you're doing these habits. It's obviously very complex. So we're trying to simplify it as much as we can today. And towards the end, I'm going to talk to you about how we actually reset. How do you reset something that you're addicted to? Okay. Thank you, Anu. That's so nice of you to say. Really appreciate that. So you're on a high. Know that a low is coming, okay? So for anybody who's like, oh man, I've been feeling low for a long time, that just means that your pain is really high. So hopefully if you start to crave things, do things outside of the usual, so you try to gain some of that novel stimuli, you can still feel pleasure. That pleasure is there, especially if you've been feeling pain. Now, if you've constantly been giving yourself pleasure, so like, you're watching new movies, you're playing video games, you're eating all this delicious food from takeout, you're going out with your friends and socializing. All of that is dopamine spiking, right? So then you may come to a weekend and be like, oh man, why am I not feeling fulfilled? Because you've just had all of these peaks. So you're gonna have to give yourself a little bit of a dopamine deprivation state so that then you can get back to pleasure again, okay? Because the truth is we have a pool of dopamine. It's a limited pool. It's always ready, but it's limited. So if you go too high on your dopamine release, and this can happen over years as well, which is the messed up part that you can't really calculate at any given point in time. How much dopamine do I have? I don't know. I have no idea. You kind of have to feel it in the way that you feel pleasure and the way that you feel pain. So if you keep giving yourself all of these dopamine spikes, then this pool of dopamine is going to deplete and you will have no dopamine left to be released until you can create more. This is from the book Dopamine Nation, and it shows you that you can't just get rid of dopamine. Dopamine's there to give us signals, and so we need to learn how to build a relationship with it versus just be like, okay, dopamine's bad. Not really. So dopamine is more about wanting than liking. And here's an example to demonstrate that. So they had these genetically engineered mice that were unable to make dopamine. So they will not seek out food. And they will starve to death even when the food is placed just inches from their mouth. What? Yet if the food is put directly into their mouth, they will chew it and they will eat the food and they may seem to enjoy it even, okay? So there are these debates around motivation and pleasure, but when we think about dopamine and we use it to measure the addictive potential of a drug or a behavior, the more dopamine the drug releases in the brain's reward pathway, the faster and more addictive the drug or the behavior, okay? So this can be with anything. Dopamine governs everything in our lives. So the more spike it gives you, the more you're going to have chances of being addicted to this thing, okay? Okay, let's keep going here because I want to show you a little bit about the tail of the dopamine release. So if you don't enjoy exercise, for example, you're not going to get the same hit or the same pleasure from somebody who does enjoy exercise. So that's why it's very individual to you. Here you see enjoyable exercise as much above the rest, and then you see unenjoyable exercise as below, right? The peak is way lower. These are just examples, by the way. These are not real numbers, okay? I just want to make sure that nobody comes at me for that. So yeah, feel free to Google dopamine release schedules for specific behaviors. The internet is, a wealth of information. So go ahead and if you're ever interested, what does, calisthenics release for dopamine release? I'm sure it's there. Just say calisthenics dopamine release example, and you should be able to find it. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about cold exposure. This is by no means a plug for cold exposure. This is just a fact that I'm sharing. So take from it what you will, okay? So everybody experiences alertness when they get into cold water. Everyone. You're going to have increased dopamine by 2.5x the baseline, and it's a sustained rise. So it's a slow build instead of a quick drop. It's slow, okay? And it also takes a long time to come back down. It takes about 3 hours to come back down to baseline. This is very different from cocaine or exercise, where you might feel the same peak, the same intensity, but it's going to take not as long to be done, right? So you're going to have a quick drop versus cold exposure has a nice long release, about 3 hours long. So if you're interested in the amount of cold exposure, like temperature-wise, what is a good measure? 13 degrees Celsius, apparently, which is hella cold, by the way, because that's about 37, our body temperature is 37 degrees, right? Or 38 degrees. And so 13 degrees is much lower. What you're doing, though, is you're evoking this norepinephrine release immediately. And that's what allows you to feel that euphoric feeling. If you've ever done a cold shower or an ice bath, you know what I'm talking about. And then also that release, when you ask people, how do you feel after cold exposure? People will say they feel very focused. So, hey, if you're all about focus, clarity of mind, feeling euphoric, cold exposure may be your way to have pain. This is voluntary pain you're putting yourself through so that then you can feel that pleasure. It's like a constant push and pull. In order to feel more pleasure in the future, you can experience voluntary pain today. If you did cold exposure every day, then you would get habitualized to it. And when you get habitualized to any behavior, dopamine doesn't release the same way. So dopamine releases when we have novel stimuli. So if I'm out here being like, cold water is the best, I'm gonna do cold immersion every single day. On week 5, I'm not gonna feel the same amount of euphoria after a cold shower than how I did on week 1. That's just the way it goes. We can't be doing every single thing every single day and feeling the same level of intensity of pleasure. Our brain just doesn't work that way. So, how often, in terms of frequency, you could do it at a variable release schedule. So that's really what we're going to talk about in just a second. But a variable release schedule is how you get yourself to not be habitualizing to something. So once you do it 2 days later, then maybe you do it 5 days later, then maybe you do it the next day, and then maybe you do it 4 days later. You're just giving your brain no pattern to latch onto, okay? Let's keep going here because this is some interesting and exciting stuff. What do you do? What do you do if you're like, hey, I don't really, this is too complicated for me. What do I do? So first you start auditing yourself. And I know that doesn't sound fun at all. It's not, it's more it's more systematic. It's a systematic approach, okay? So dopamine audit, what that means is you're going to journal about things that you're doing, about things that you're doing to get pleasure. So whether you're going on a run, how long was that run for? Did you do something after the run? Did you do something before the run? Or you listen to music on the run? And you're starting to familiarize yourself with the various aspects of life that you're involving yourself with in terms of pleasure and pain, okay? You can log about your food. You can log about your drug consumption habits. And by drug, I mean literally anything. Coffee is a drug, right? You can talk about your screen time habits. Anything that you think gives you pleasure, you log about it, okay? So, for example, if you are running and you've got music that you're listening to, and you're running after an energy drink, and you also have specific running shoes on, what you're doing is you're increasing the criteria for yourself to feel pleasure. Okay? I'll say that one more time. When you layer multiple habits on top of one another, you are increasing the criteria and the conditions for you to feel pleasure. So when you go on a run without having an energy drink, without music, your brain might come to the conclusion that, this is a shitty run. This is terrible. I did not have fun. It wasn't as productive as the other ones. But is that true? Okay, your brain is creating these sorts of levels of pleasure, and what is normal, and therefore what is less than normal, is less pleasurable. Okay, so when I go on a run, it's not that I don't listen to music. I usually won't, but when I do listen to music, it feels just so amazing. I can't even explain it, you know? And I won't listen to music like every other day or every week. It's a variable release schedule. So there's no pattern to it, which is why when I do listen to music when I run, it just feels like I'm on top of the world. Very simple criteria. Go on a run without anything. And then when you want to feel that spike, that pleasure, you just layer something on and you feel like you're on top of the world, right? Very easy to feel pleasure in that way. All right, let's talk a little bit about hard work versus rewards, shall we? And this is right before we get into what a reset looks like. If you want to reset your dopamine and come back to your original, I'm going to put that in quotes, your original baseline, then there is a way to do that. So, hard work is hard. If it was easy, everybody would be doing it, right? So most people don't like working hard. They would rather just achieve that end goal. Why am I working hard? Let's just get right to that end result and never have to do the hard work again, right? So giving yourself a reward at the end is going to make you associate the entire pleasure of that activity with the reward alone. And you're not going to associate pleasure with the effort. So if you go on a run, you eat a big meal at the end. That big meal is going to be what you look forward to and what gives you all the pleasure. And that run is just going to be like, whatever, not really that fun. So you're starting to associate pleasure with the reward, and you're cognitively changing your coding. So your brain's wiring is literally changing because it's like, why do all of this hard work when the pleasure is right here? Usually rewards are at the end. So if you know like the habit cycle, where most habits start with a cue or a trigger, and then there's a series of patterns, and then at the end you have the reward. So rewards are usually at the end, which means we are extending the time perception of the entire activity and therefore associating less and less pleasure from the activity itself, and most of the pleasure from the reward only. So when you are, accessing reward from the effort, that is really where dopamine is going to start to have a more positive relationship with the hard work itself and not with just the reward at the end, okay? So for example, or I'm just going to keep using this running example, there's a biking example, or whatever you consider as hard work. When you're doing the hard work, it's going to depend on your self-talk. What do you say to yourself? So when I'm running, I like to think about my pace. I like to think about my breathing. I like to give myself positive words of affirmations, being like, you're doing really good, keep going, steady pace, looking nice, that calf's getting a nice juice boost, whatever you want to say to yourself to make yourself feel better during the reward is how you're going to associate dopamine with the effort itself. Okay? And that's really the hack, associating dopamine with the effort itself. So this is like your intrinsic reward system. It's something that you're building from your internal needs, your internal need for pleasure, your internal motivating factors. I used to be somebody who was extrinsically motivated. Like I would get motivated when somebody told me that I was a good speaker, or when somebody told me that, you seem really smart. You can totally handle this puzzle. And then I'd be like, yeah, I can handle this puzzle. Or like if I got cash, if I got paid for something, of course I'd be like, wow, I'm totally going to do that again. So by associating with extrinsic motivation, you're building dopamine based on that reward system, and you're not associating pleasure with the effort. So regardless of how much money I made, did I actually enjoy the thing that I did? If not, why am I doing it, right? Life is not going to be fun. Life is going to be hard work, and then, I get a little hit of pleasure at the end. Okay. But what if we could have pleasure all through the journey, and then who cares what the reward is? I already got my reward. That's what we're talking about here, that intrinsic motivation, when you can train yourself to be like, damn, I'm working hard. I'm actually being productive. I'm like doing all the things that I set my mind to, and I have all of this like self-efficacy to get it done. Like that is really where you're building that nice, sustainable relationship with effort. The other thing to share here that Dr. Anna Lemke shares in the book Dopamine Nation is about chronological self-binding. What that is limiting your habit intake. So whether that is a behavior that you're addicted to or a drug that you're addicted to limit that to specific times of the day or during a specific time window. So doing it only on the weekends, doing it only for an hour in the morning and an hour at night, whatever pattern you want to figure out for yourself, but that is considered chronological self-binding, and that also seems to have positive impacts for some people. All right, so just to reinforce, the definition of addiction that we're playing with here is this. It's broadly defined as the continued and compulsive consumption of a substance or behavior despite its harm to self and others. Now, it's going to be you that determines what harm means, right? Harm can be not being productive. Harm can be not wanting to sleep and skipping out on sleep, getting 5 hours instead of 8. Wow, that's really going to affect you long term, right? Harm can be not drinking water because you're only drinking pop, right? You have to define what that harm looks like for yourself, and what you define as self-harm is going to be different to what I define as self-harm, right? And that's just how we all have our own different standards of what our baseline is, what gives us pleasure, what gives us pain. So this is the beautiful, I'm just going to go back over, actually, I'm going to move myself over here and talk to you through there. There we go. So this is the method. How easy and simple to remember by using the words dopamine. This is shared in the book Dopamine Nation, again, by Dr. Anna Lemke. And basically what she's done is she's created this step-by-step process, this system, using the word dopamine. So if you ever forget, just come back to the word dopamine, where each letter is one of the steps. And yes, it's chronological or sequential. How great, okay? So D, you start with data. What are you doing currently? That's really where that journaling comes in, right? The audit journal, the dopamine audit journaling. What are you doing? What are you getting pleasure from? What are you not getting pleasure from? What's giving you pain? All of that stuff. Then the O is your objectives. What are your objectives when you think about your life, right? What are your objectives with your career, with your personal habits, with your goals, with your relationships? Write those down. Think about your objectives as an individual. What are you trying to get out of life? Then P is your problems. What are your problems currently that's stopping you from meeting those objectives? And that can be your personal habits. It can be some kind of drug consumption. It can be limitations that you may see within your own circumstance right now. Those are your problems. A is abstinence. So this is where we start to come out of that water, where we start to feel like we have some air, okay? Abstinence is a 30-day period where you decide to abstain from the behavior or the drug that is causing you to become quote unquote addicted. Now remember, we're using that loose term of addiction, right? The one where minor addictions also count. Constantly checking your phone, for example. And you are going to abstain from this behavior for 30 days. Completely stop it, okay? During that period of time, that 30 days, you want to start becoming mindful of your language. How do you talk to yourself when you are feeling that low? Because the first 2 weeks of this 30-day period, let me tell you, it's gonna feel like shit. I've done some dopamine detoxes, got a video of it on YouTube if you're interested in watching. I think I stopped using my phone, so no social media. I didn't do video games, and I was in a new environment which didn't have like all of my, just like fixes, my chocolates and all my things. Didn't have any of that. So first 2 weeks, you feel low. So in that time, how are you talking to yourself? Are you being positive and nurturing and compassionate with yourself? Because that is how you want to be, right? You want to be mindful that this down is because of a voluntary choice, right? You've chosen to feel pain now so that you can feel pleasure later. Then comes I, which is the insight. So the last 2 weeks, so week 3 and week 4 of your abstinence period is really where you're going to have some insights. What am I learning about myself? Some people feel like they're becoming themselves again. They're connecting back to who they are. So what are your insights? What are you feeling as you're going through this experiment? And then N is next steps. So next steps is where you determine whether you want to go back to this behavior or this drug. And here's the good news. You don't have to completely remove it from your life. It's all about re-strategizing and thinking about what is the right relationship I want to have. Now, I want to be very clear. If you are truly addicted to something, like diagnosed as addicted or classified as addicted by someone who's a psychotherapist or somebody who's specialized, then I would say that you'd want to be doing this step with supervision so that they can sort of work with you to figure out what those next steps can be. Because remember, every single habit and behavior has different dopamine spikes. So if you are someone who is addicted to amphetamines, well, guess what? It's going to be very difficult for you to go back to that, because the moment you go back to that, you're going to get that dopamine spike again and you're going to be addicted again, right? Chances are. So it really depends on the behavior, which is why this, you do this if you are somebody who has one of those minor addictions and not somebody who's actually classified as addicted, because then you might want to do it with the help of a healthcare professional, okay? And then last step that you have is experiment. So this is where you think about the cadence. So for example, with video games, it was something that, we would be doing often. I'd be doing it instead of doing other work that would actually be better for me. So I started to experiment with how often am I going to be playing video games? And if I do play video games, how long of a period am I going to be playing it for? So that's that chronological self-binding, where I'm limiting myself to certain hours of the day or certain time frequencies. Cool? So let's see here. Eddie's saying, oh my, that abstinence part is going to be a pain in the butt. Yes, it is. It is. The first 2 weeks, don't expect it to be a walk in the park. The lessons of balance, okay? So, the relentless pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain is going to lead to pain. I also should say that there are 10 lessons of balance in the book Dopamine Nation. So if you're super curious, highly recommend reading that book. Just because of what we talked about today, I feel like these 7 are the takeaways from today's session, right? Number 2, recovery begins with abstinence. So if you truly feel like you are addicted to something and you can't concentrate, you're not productive, you're not living life in fulfillment or in alignment with your purpose, dopamine detox, let's go. All right, number 3, abstinence is going to reset the brain's reward pathway, and with it, the capacity to take joy in simple pleasures. You're walking outside, you see the sun, and you're like, that warmth on my skin, just feels so great. Imagine feeling pleasure from something so basic. Life is good, right? Number 4, self-binding. So this is that limitation or that deprivation that you create for yourself. Self-binding is going to create literal and metacognitive space between desire and consumption. So we're no longer going to be tied to immediate gratification. We can prolong this space between desire and consumption. Number 5, pressing on the side of pain is actually going to reset our balance to the side of pleasure. So when you do activities that are voluntarily painful, like a cold bath, like a cold shower, like going on a long run that you've never done before, that is going to reset your dopamine balance to the side of pleasure. Now, you also want to beware of getting addicted to pain, because just like getting addicted to pleasure, we can also get addicted to pain. And if you get addicted to pain, it's going to be very difficult to feel that pleasure. Or you're just going to be so addicted that you're going to start to get pleasure from pain, and then I don't even know what happens then, to be honest. I really don't. Number 7, radical honesty promotes awareness, enhances intimacy, and then fosters a plenty or an abundance mindset. So as you're doing this process, when you're being mindful, you're writing about your problems, you're writing about your objectives, you want to be radically honest with yourself. You cannot fool anybody in this stage, especially not yourself. So practice that radical honesty with yourself. The way that our world works is we're naturally going to be addicted to certain things, especially when you think of social media, when you think of how all of these reward systems have worked. Marketing psychologists are just getting smarter and smarter, and they understand how to get us attached to things through this dopamine reward pathway wiring. So for us, it's really about coming back to the basics and understanding, okay, if I'm feeling like I'm getting too much dopamine, not really getting pleasure from the simple things anymore, maybe it's time to do a dopamine detox. And that's really it. So I would love to end here and, kind of say that at the end of the day, the control is in your hands, right? You have more control, more power than you think you do. So take back what's rightfully yours and reset your pain and pleasure balance.